A lot of our neighbors on North 3rd Street were kind of weird. A clan of gypsies lived down the block in a big, falling apart house with plywood nailed over the porch to create more indoor space. They were always stealing our stuff, and one time, after Brian's pogo stick had disappeared, he saw one of the old gypsy women bouncing down the sidewalk on it. She wouldn't give it back, so Mom got into a big argument with the head of the clan, and the next day we found a chicken with its throat cut on our doorstep. It was some kind of gypsy hex. Mom decided, as she put it, to fight magic with magic. She took a ham bone out of the beans and went down to the gypsy's house, waving it in the air. Standing on the sidewalk, she held up the bone like a crucifix at an exorcism, and called down a curse on the entire gypsy clan and their house, vowing that it would collapse with the lot of them in it and that the bowels of the earth would open up and swallow them forever if they bothered us again. The next morning Brian's pogo stick was lying in the front yard. The neighborhood also had its share of perverts. Mostly, they were shabby, hunched men with wheedling voices who hung around on street corners and followed us to and from school, trying to give us boosts when we climbed a fence, offering us candy and loose change if we would go play with them. We called them creeps and hollered at them to leave us alone, but I worried about hurting their feelings because I couldn't help wondering if maybe they were telling the truth, that all they wanted was to be our friends. At night Mom and Dad always left the front door and the back door and all the windows open. Since we had no air conditioning, they explained, we needed to let the air circulate. From time to time, a vagrant or a wino would wander through the front door, assuming the house was deserted. When we woke up in the morning, we'd find one asleep in a front room. As soon as we roused them, they shambled off apologetically. Mom always assured us they were just harmless drunks. Maureen, who was 4 and had a terrible fear of bogeymen, kept dreaming that intruders in Halloween masks were coming through the open doors to get us. One night when I was almost 10, I was awakened by someone running his hands over my private parts. At first it was confusing. Lori and I slept in the same bed, and I thought maybe she was moving in her sleep. I groggily pushed the hand away. I just want to play a game with you, a man's voice said. I recognized the voice. It belonged to a scraggly guy with sunken cheeks, who had been hanging around North 3rd Street recently. He'd tried to walk us home from school and had given Brian a magazine called Kids on a Farm, with pictures of boys and girls wearing only underpants. Pervert, I yelled and kicked at the man's hand. Brian came running into the room with a hatchet he kept by his bed, and the man bolted out the door. Dad was out that night, and when Mom slept, she was dead to the world, so Brian and I ran after the man ourselves. As we got to the sidewalk, lit by the purplish glow from the streetlights, he disappeared around the corner. We searched for him for a few blocks, Brian whacking at the bushes with his hatchet, but we couldn't find him. On our way home, we were slapping each other's hands and pumping our fists in the air, as if we'd won a boxing match. We decided we had been pervert hunting, which was just like demon hunting except the enemy was real and dangerous instead of being the product of a kid's overactive imagination. The next day, when Dad came home and we told him what had happened, he said he was going to kill that lowlife son of a bitch. He and Brian and I Went out on a serious pervert hunt. Our blood up. We searched the streets for hours, but we never did find the guy. I asked Mom and Dad if we should close the doors and windows when we went to sleep. They wouldn't consider it. We needed the fresh air, they said, and it was essential that we refuse to surrender to fear. So the windows stayed open. Maureen kept having nightmares of men in Halloween masks. And every now and then, when Brian and I were feeling revved up, he'd get a machete and I'd get a baseball bat and we'd go pervert hunting, clearing the streets of the creeps who preyed on kids. Mom and Dad liked to make a big point about never surrendering to fear, or to prejudice, or to the narrow-minded conformist sticks in the mud, who tried to tell everyone else what was proper. We were supposed to ignore those benighted sheep, as Dad called them. One day Mom went with us kids to the library at the Civic Center. Since the weather was sweltering, she suggested we cool off by jumping into the fountain in front of the building. The water was too shallow to swim in, but we paddled around pretending to be crocodiles until we attracted a small crowd of people who kept insisting to Mom that swimming was forbidden in the fountain. Mind your own beeswax, Mom replied. I was feeling kind of embarrassed and started to climb out. Ignore the fuddy-duddies, Mom told me, and to make it clear she paid no never mind to such people or their opinions, she clambered into the fountain and plopped down beside us, sending gallons of water sloshing over the sides. It never bothered Mom if people turned and stared at her, even in church. Although she thought nuns were killjoys and she didn't follow all the church's rules word for word, she treated the 10 Commandments more like the 10 suggestions. Mom considered herself a devout Catholic, and took us to Mass most Sundays. St. Mary's was the biggest, most beautiful church I had ever seen. It was made of sand-colored adobe and had 2 soaring steeples, a gigantic circular stained glass window, and leading up to the 2 main doors, a pair of sweeping staircases covered with pigeons. The other mothers dressed up for Mass, wearing black lace mantillas on their heads and clutching green or red or yellow handbags that matched their shoes. Mom thought it was superficial to worry about how you looked. She said God thought the same way, so she'd go to church in torn or paint-splattered clothes. It was your inner spirit and not your outward appearance that mattered, she said, and come hymn time. She showed the whole congregation her spirit, belting out the words in such a powerful voice that people in the pews in front of us would turn around and stare. Church was particularly excruciating when Dad came along. Dad had been raised Baptist, but he didn't like religion and didn't believe in God. He believed in science and reason, he said, not superstition and voodoo. But Mom had refused to have children unless Dad agreed to raise them as Catholics and to attend church himself on holy days of obligation. Dad sat in the pew fuming and shifting around and trying to bite his tongue while the priest carried on about Jesus resurrecting Lazarus from the dead and the communicants filed up to eat the body and drink the blood of Christ. Finally, when Dad was unable to stand it any longer, he'd shout out something to challenge the priest. He didn't do it to be hostile. He hollered out his point in a friendly tone. Yo, Padre. He'd say. The priest usually ignored Dad and tried to go on with his sermon. But Dad persisted. He'd challenge the priest about the scientific impossibility of the miracles, and when the priest continued to ignore him, he'd get mad and yell out something about Pope Alexander. This bastard children, or Pope Leo X's hedonism, or Pope Nicholas III's simony, or the murders committed in the name of the Church during the Spanish Inquisition. But what could you expect, he'd say, from an institution run by celibate men who wore dresses? At that point the ushers would tell us we'd have to leave. Don't worry, God understands. Mom said, He knows that your father is a cross we must bear. City life was getting to Dad. I'm starting to feel like a rat in a maze. He told me he hated the way everything in Phoenix was so organized, with time cards, bank accounts, telephone bills, parking meters, tax forms, alarm clocks, PTA meetings, and pollsters knocking on the door and prying into your affairs. He hated all the people who lived in air-conditioned houses with the windows permanently sealed, and drove air-conditioned cars to 9-to-5 jobs in air-conditioned office buildings that he said were little more than gussied-up prisons. Just the sight of those people on their way to work made him feel hemmed in and itchy. He began complaining that we were all getting too soft, too dependent on creature comforts, and that we were losing touch with the natural order of the world. Dad missed the wilderness. He needed to be roaming free in open country and living among untamed animals. He felt it was good for your soul to have buzzards and coyotes and snakes around. That was the way man was meant to live, he'd say, in harmony with the wild, like the Indians, not this lords of the earth crap, trying to rule the entire goddamn planet, cutting down all the forests and killing every creature you couldn't bring to heel. One day we heard on the radio that a woman in the suburbs had seen a mountain lion behind her house and had called the police, who shot the animal. Dad got so angry he put his fist through a wall. That mountain lion had as much right to his life as that sour old biddy does to hers. He said, "You can't kill something just because it's wild." Dad stewed for a while, sucking on a beer, and then he told us all to get in the car. "Where are we going?" I asked. We hadn't been on a single expedition since we moved to Phoenix. I missed them. "I'm going to show you," he said, "that no animal, no matter how big or wild, is dangerous as long as you know what you're doing." We all piled into the car. Dad drove, nursing another beer and cussing under his breath about that innocent mountain lion and the chicken shit suburbanite. We turned in at the city zoo. None of us kids had ever been to a zoo before, and I didn't really know what to expect. Lori said she thought zoos should be outlawed. Mom, who had Maureen in one arm and her sketch pad under the other, pointed out that the animals had traded freedom for security. She said that when she looked at them, she would pretend not to see the bars at the entrance gate. Dad bought our tickets, muttering about the idiocy of paying money to look at animals, and led us down the walk. Most of the cages were patches of dirt surrounded by iron bars, with forlorn gorillas or restless bears or irritable monkeys or anxious gazelles huddled in the corners. A lot of the kids were having fun, gawking and laughing and throwing peanuts at the animals, but the sight of those poor creatures made my throat swell up. I've got half a mind to sneak in here some night and free these critters. Quote, Dad said, "Can I help?" I asked. He mussed my hair. "Me and you, mountain goat," he said. "We'll carry out our own animal prison break." We stopped at a bridge. Below it, in a deep pit, alligators sunned themselves on rocks surrounding a pond. The biddy who got that mountain lion shot didn't understand animal psychology. Dad said, if you let them know you're not afraid, they'll leave you alone. Dad pointed to the biggest, scaliest alligator. Me and that nasty-looking bastard's going to have us a staring contest. Dad stood on the bridge, glowering at the alligator. At first it seemed to be asleep, but then it blinked and looked up at Dad. Dad continued staring, his eyes in a fierce squint. After a minute the alligator thrashed its tail, looked away, and slid into the water. See, you just have to communicate your position. Quote, Dad said, maybe he would have gone for a swim anyway. Brian whispered, what do you mean? I asked. Didn't you see how nervous that gator got? Dad made him do it. We followed Dad to the lion's den, but the lions were sleeping, so Dad said we should leave them alone. The aardvark was busy hoovering up ants, and Dad said you shouldn't disturb eating animals, so we passed it by and went on to the cheetah's cage, which was about as big as our living room and surrounded by a chain fence. The lone cheetah paced back and forth, the muscles in his shoulders shifting with each step. Dad folded his arms on his chest and studied the cheetah. He's a good animal, fastest four-footed creature on the planet, he declared. Not happy about being in this damn cage, but he's resigned to it, and he's no longer angry. Let's see if he's hungry. Dad took me to the concession stand. He told the lady running it that he had a rare medical condition and couldn't eat cooked meat, so he'd like to buy a raw hamburger. Yeah, right, the sales clerk said. She told Dad the zoo did not allow the sale of uncooked meat, because foolish people tried to feed it to the animals. I'd like to feed her lard ass to the animals. Dad muttered. He bought me a bag of popcorn, and we returned to the cheetah cage. Dad squatted outside the fence opposite the cheetah. The animal came closer to the bars and studied him curiously. Dad kept looking at him, but not in the angry-eyed way he had stared down the alligator. The cheetah looked back. Finally, he sat down. Dad stepped over the chain fence and knelt right next to the bars where the cheetah was sitting. The cheetah remained still, looking at Dad. Dad slowly raised his right hand and put it up against the cage. The cheetah looked at Dad's hand but didn't move. Dad calmly put his hand between the iron bars of the cage and rested it on the cheetah's neck. The cheetah moved the side of his face against Dad's hand, as if asking to be petted. Dad gave the cheetah the kind of hearty, vigorous petting you'd give a big dog. Situation under control, Dad said and beckoned us over. We climbed under the chain fence and knelt around Dad while he petted the cheetah. By then a few people had begun to gather. One man was calling to us to get back behind the chain fence. We ignored him. I knelt close to the cheetah. My heart was beating fast, but I wasn't scared, only excited. I could feel the cheetah's hot breath on my face. He looked right at me. His amber eyes were steady but sad, as if he knew he'd never see the plains of Africa again. May I pet him, please? I asked Dad. Dad took my hand and slowly guided it to the side of the cheetah's neck. It was soft but also bristly. The cheetah turned his head and put his moist nose up against my hand. Then his big pink tongue unfolded from his mouth, and he licked my hand. I gasped. Dad opened my hand and held my fingers back. The cheetah licked my palm, his tongue warm and rough, like sandpaper dipped in hot water. I felt all tingly. I think he likes me. I said. He does. Dad said. He also likes the popcorn, salt and butter on your hand. There was a small crowd around the cage now, and one particularly frantic woman grabbed my shirt and tried to pull me over the chain. It's all right, I told her. My dad does stuff like this all the time. He should be arrested, she shouted. Okay, kids, Dad said. The civilians are revolting. We better skedaddle. We climbed over the chain. When I looked back, the cheetah was following us along the side of the cage. Before we could make our way through the crowd, a heavy man in a navy blue uniform came running toward us. He was holding on to the gun and nightstick on his belt, which made him look like he was running with his hands on his hips. He was shouting about regulations and how idiots had been killed climbing into cages and how we all had to leave immediately. He grabbed Dad by the shoulder, but Dad pushed him off and assumed a fighting stance. Some of the men in the crowd clutched Dad's arms, and Mom asked Dad to please do what the guard had ordered. Dad nodded and held out his hands in a peace gesture. He led us through the crowd and toward the exit, chuckling and shaking his head to let us kids know that these fools were not worth the time it would take to kick their butts. I could hear people around us whispering about the crazy drunk man and his dirty little urchin children, but who cared what they thought? None of them had ever had their hand licked by a cheetah. It was around this time that Dad lost his job. He said there was nothing to worry about, because Phoenix was so big and growing so fast that he could find another job at a site where they hadn't spread lies about him. Then he got fired from his second job and from his third, and was kicked out of the electricians' union and started doing odd jobs and day work. Whatever money Mom had inherited from Grandma Smith had disappeared, and once again we started scraping by. I didn't go hungry. Hot lunch at school cost $0.25, and we could usually afford that. When we couldn't, and I told Mrs. Ellis, my fourth grade teacher, that I had forgotten my quarter, she said her records indicated that someone had already paid for me. Even though it seemed awfully coincidental, I didn't want to push my luck by asking too many questions about who this someone was. I ate the hot lunch. Sometimes that lunch was all I had to eat all day, but I could get by just fine on one meal. One afternoon when Brian and I had come home to an empty fridge, we went out to the alley behind the house looking for bottles to redeem. Down the alley was the delivery bay of a warehouse. A big green dumpster stood in the parking lot. When no one was looking, Brian and I pushed open the lid, climbed up, and dived inside to search for bottles. I was afraid it might be full of yucky garbage. Instead, we found an astonishing treasure. Cardboard boxes filled with loose chocolates. Some of them were whitish and dried out looking, and some were covered with a mysterious green mold, but most of them were fine. We pigged out on chocolates, and from then on, whenever Mom was too busy to make dinner or we were out of food, we'd go back to the dumpster to see if any new chocolate was waiting for us. From time to time, it was. For some reason, there were no kids Maureen's age on North 3rd Street. She was too young to run around with me and Brian, so she spent most of her time riding up and down on the red tricycle Dad had bought for her, and playing with her imaginary friends. They all had names, and she would talk to them for hours. They'd laugh together, carry on detailed conversations, even argue. One day she came home in tears, and when I asked her why she was crying, she said she'd gotten into a fight with Susie Q, one of the imaginary friends. Maureen was 5 years younger than Brian, and Mom said that since she didn't have any allies in the family around her age, she needed special treatment. Mom decided Maureen needed to enroll in preschool, but she said she didn't want her youngest daughter dressed in the thrift store clothes the rest of us wore. Mom told us we would have to go shoplifting. Isn't that a sin? I asked Mom. Not exactly. Mom said, God doesn't mind you bending the rules a little if you have a good reason. It's sort of like justifiable homicide. This is justifiable pilfering. Mom's plan was for her and Maureen to go into the dressing room of a store with an armful of new clothes for Maureen to try on. When they came out, Mom would tell the clerk she didn't like any of the dresses. At that point Lori, Brian, and I would create a ruckus to distract the clerk. While Mom hid a dress under a raincoat she would be carrying on her arm. We got 3 or 4 nice dresses for Maureen that way, but on one excursion, when Brian and I were pretending to punch each other out and Mom was in the process of slipping a dress under her raincoat, the saleslady turned to Mom and asked if she intended to buy that dress she was holding. Mom had no choice but to pay for it. $14 for a child's dress, she said as we left the store. It's highway robbery. Dad devised an ingenious way to come up with extra cash. He figured out that when you made a withdrawal from the drive-through window at the bank, it took a few minutes for the transaction to register in the computer. So he would open a bank account, and a week or so later, he would withdraw all the money from a teller inside the bank while Mom withdrew the same amount from the drive-through window. Lori said it sounded outright felonious, but Dad said all he was doing was outsmarting the fat cat bank owners who shylocked the common man by charging usurious interest rates. Where innocent expressions. Mom told us kids the first time we dropped Dad off in front of the bank. Will we have to go to a juvenile delinquent center if we get busted? I asked. Mom assured me it was all perfectly legal. People overdraw their accounts all the time, she said. If we get caught, we'll just pay a little overdraft fee. She explained that it was sort of like taking out a loan, without all the messy paperwork. But as we drove up to the teller's window, Mom seemed to get edgy and giggled nervously as she passed the withdrawal slip through the bulletproof window. I think she was enjoying the thrill of taking from the rich. After the woman inside passed us the cash, Mom drove around to the front of the bank. In a minute, Dad strolled out. He climbed into the front of the car, turned around, and, with a wicked grin, held up a stack of bills and riffled them with his thumb. The reason Dad was having a tough time getting steady work, as he kept trying to tell us, was that the electricians' union in Phoenix was corrupt. It was run by the mob, he said, which controlled all the construction projects in the city, so before he could get a decent job, he had to run organized crime out of town. That required a lot of undercover research, and the best place to gather information was at the bars the mobsters owned. So Dad started spending most of his time in those joints. Mom rolled her eyes whenever Dad mentioned his research. I began to have my own doubts about what he was up to. He came home in such a drunken fury that Mom usually hid while we kids tried to calm him down. He broke windows and smashed dishes and furniture until he'd spent all his anger. Then he'd look around at the mess and at us kids standing there. When he recognized what he'd done, he hung his head in weariness and shame. Then he'd sink to his knees and pitch forward, face first on the floor. After Dad had collapsed, I would try to pick up the place, but Mom always made me stop. She'd been reading books on how to cope with an alcoholic, and they said that drunks didn't remember their rampages, so if you cleaned up after them, they'd think nothing had happened. Your father needs to see the mess he's making of our lives, Mom said. But when Dad got up, he'd act as if all the wreckage didn't exist, and no one discussed it with him. The rest of us had to get used to stepping over broken furniture and shattered glass. Mom had taught us to pick Dad's pocket when he passed out. We got pretty good at it. Once, after I'd rolled Dad and collected a handful of change, I pried his fingers loose from the bottle in his hand. It was 3/4 empty. I stared at the amber liquid. Mom never touched the stuff, and I wondered what Dad found so irresistible. I opened the bottle and sniffed. The awful smell stung my nose, but after working up my courage, I took a swig. It had a hideously thick taste, smoky, and so hot. It burned my tongue. I ran to the bathroom, spat it out, and rinsed my mouth. I just took a swig of booze. I told Brian, "It's the worst thing I've ever tasted in my life." Brian grabbed the bottle out of my hand. He emptied it into the kitchen sink, then led me out to the shed and opened up a wooden trunk in the back marked toy box. It was filled with empty liquor bottles. Whenever Dad passed out, Brian said, he took the bottle Dad had been drinking, emptied it, and hid it in the trunk. He'd wait until he had 10 or 12, then tote them to a garbage can a few blocks away, because if Dad saw the empty bottles, he would get furious. "I have a really good feeling about this Christmas," Mom announced in early December. Lori pointed out that the last few months hadn't gone so well. "Exactly," Mom said. "This is God's way of telling us to take charge of our own fates. God helps those who help themselves." She had such a good feeling that she'd decided that this year we were going to celebrate Christmas on Christmas Day, instead of a week later. Mom was an expert thrift store shopper. She read the labels on the clothes and turned over dishes and vases to study the markings on the bottom. She had no qualms about telling a saleslady that a dress marked at 25 cents was worth only a dime, and she usually got it at that. Pre-CE. Mom took us thrift store shopping for weeks before that Christmas, giving us each $1 to spend on presents. I got a red glass bud vase for Mom, an onyx ashtray for Dad, a model car kit for Brian, a book about elves for Lori, and a stuffed tiger with a loose ear that Mom helped me sew back in place for Maureen. On Christmas morning, Mom took us down to a gas station that sold Christmas trees. She selected a tall, dark, but slightly dried out Douglas fir. "This poor old tree isn't going to sell by the end of the day, and it needs someone to love it," she told the man and offered him $3. The man looked at the tree and looked at Mom and looked at us kids. My dress had buttons missing. Holes were appearing along the seams of Maureen's t-shirt. "Lady, this one's been marked down to $1," he said. "We